Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. Hope that you're all having a wonderful weekend. Today is Sunday, August 23rd. I've got a very exciting show for you guys today. If you liked any of the shows kind of earlier in the summer, it's kind of a similar theme. Today's sort of a romantic day. That tends to happen fairly often. It's a pretty common movie theme, so that's what we're doing again today. Today's movies are Chemical Hearts. It's a brand new movie streaming on Amazon Prime. Then my weekly watch this week was Almost Famous. It's a movie that's been on my watch list forever. Wanted to check that one out. And then my weekly recommendation is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which I can't believe I haven't reviewed yet. It's one of my favorite movies. It's been on Netflix for a hot minute now, and I rewatched it just because I wanted to see it again, and I absolutely adore this film. Can't wait to recommend it to you guys. And then my last segment today is going to be top 5 movie couples. So not celebrity couples, but couples in movies. Some of my favorites, which was a much harder list to put together than I expected. But that's today's episode, and let's get started. Alright, so Chemical Hearts is a brand new film streaming on Amazon Prime. It stars Lily Reinhart and Austin Abrams. I always like reading the IMDb synopsis before I kind of like try and create my own synopsis for the movie. But in this one it says, a high school transfer student finds a new passion when she begins to work on the school's newspaper, which really is not what this movie is about at all. And this implies that it's sort of from Lily Reinhart's perspective, which is very misleading. It's really not from her perspective at all. So basically this film follows Henry, who's our main character, and his sort of pursuit in both understanding and falling in love with the new student at his school, who's sort of mysterious and closed off. It's a very common trope in a lot of sort of coming of age romance movies that one of the two main characters who are the couple, one of them's very closed off, the other one has to open them up to new wonders of the world. And it kind of goes back and forth as to which character that is, but that definitely plays out here. Kind of right off the bat, my initial thoughts. I can't say that I had much expectations for this movie. It looked pretty, I don't think I'd seen a trailer. All I had seen is like a little kind of video promotion, mini scene. It was like a minute long of a monologue that Lily Reinhart's character says, Grace, in the movie. And I thought it was very corny, and I did not think it was very good. So I didn't have high expectations. I thought it was going to be kind of a mediocre, sort of like Fault in Our Stars-esque, like, I don't want to say ripoff because it's so common of a type of film, but like a little bit of a weaker version of that kind of a movie. And I have to say it was even worse than I expected. Not by too much. Like, I can't say that like I absolutely hated it. It's ultimately kind of like boring. Like, there's just not much to it. Not much that I can really say as far as like my own personal enjoyment with it. It was fun to like make fun of it. But let's get into some of the reasons why. I think most of the time it starts with the screenplay as to why I think it's so bad. And I do think that is the case here, but usually that's like the worst part. I'd say overall, like most of the choices here were pretty weak. And it's not that any of them are overtly terrible. It's just that all of them are pretty boring or uncompelling or just like poor choices for any sort of like filming aspect of this movie. So as far as the screenplay goes, it's just like from the first like 20 minutes, you can understand that every trope in the book is thrown out. So it's based on a young adult book from 2016, and it feels like it's sort of a poor man's adaptation of what the book I don't know if the book is any good. I haven't read it. I don't know any of the reviews. But I have to assume that it's at least a little bit better. A lot of the things that are in this movie are probably much more fleshed out in the book, which hopefully is the case many times, but nothing is really fleshed out in this movie. There are a lot of big themes and motifs here, most of which are very obvious that they like kind of shove down your throat. There's a motif of like walking versus running, and there's a motif of kinsukori or kintsugi, which is what it's sometimes called. The former is what they call it in the movie, which is sort of like a Japanese style of fixing pottery with gold, and both of which are very obvious motifs as to what the film is about. And then the themes are pretty apparent. But both of these motifs feel like substitutes for any actual, like, exploration of the themes at hand. They feel like, oh, here's this obvious thing that's happening throughout most of the movie. You can kind of infer what our themes are because of it, and that's sort of the only purpose that they serve. They don't complement it very well because of how apparent and obvious they are. And given how obvious they are, the one with the walking versus running could have been way more interesting because it's a pretty uncommon motif. That's not something that like you see very often. It's fairly original. And early on in the movie, our main character, Grace, walks around a bunch. She doesn't like to drive. She doesn't like to do anything else. So she walks everywhere, and it's difficult for her to walk given some sort of accident that we're as of yet unaware of. And then our main character walks a lot of places as well. And then he picks up the pace and starts to run, but when he does that, it doesn't narratively translate to any reason for him to stop walking versus running, like as far as like a thematic standpoint, and then he kind of goes back to walking at the end. So it could have come full circle, and it would go from like walking to running, which would have been really interesting, but instead they don't really like flesh that out as much as they could, and realistically nothing here is fleshed out. Even our two main characters, are just not all that interesting. Grace is clearly the most interesting idea of a character, but I say that because the film is so much not from her perspective that every like form of development that she has is either done off screen or through a montage or through information that we find out like that we're told and not shown. And a lot of times if we are shown, it's from a discovery from our main character as opposed to an actual like compelling character moment from her. And given that a lot of the themes of this film, which are a lot about like loneliness and trauma and how to get past big traumatic events in your life, we're seeing it through the eyes of just a very boring, plain character who really doesn't do anything in this film and does not have much agency. Many of the events happen to him and he doesn't have anything to do with any of these events. And so given that these themes are so large, the story would have been way more interesting coming from her or even a different character to somebody other than a lead who really has nothing going on in his life. He says in the beginning of the movie that he doesn't have anything interesting to write about, and a lot of that I think comes from the fact that he just is not all that interesting of a character, and we really have no reason to care about much of the things that he does, nor do we have any reason to care about anybody else in this movie other than Grace, if Grace was more was written more holistically and we got to see a lot of the things that she does as opposed to being told that she does all these things, because we really don't get to see any of her development. We just kind of have to infer it, and therefore she kind of becomes much more of a plot device for Henry to move forward than for an actual exploration into these bigger themes, particularly from her perspective. It also is a love story, which I have to say, given a lot of the themes of this film, framing it romantically or sexually in certain moments was just, I don't want to say disrespectful because I think you can handle it well. I just don't think it was handled well, and I think that the themes that the film has are much more interesting if not delved into like in a sort of like rose-colored glasses romantic way, and a lot of that has been done before, and in a way it's like kind of offensive sometimes. Like it just feels uncomfortable and inappropriate. At least for the third act, we as the audience like experience it much more overtly than we have for the rest of the movie. But because the first hour of the movie is framed much more romantically and idealistically, it just becomes very uncomfortable to watch this sort of like very traumatic experience that both these characters are going through. And so it just feels weird and very like we shouldn't be watching it. And because it's a love story, lots of the scenes and dialogue in this film are very corny. And I don't like using the word corny all that much because I think that can work sometimes. And I also think it's sort of a blank statement. It's hard to say what that actually means. But I think if you watch the film, it just doesn't feel natural at all. Romantic things should come from like real emotion and not just from like cheesy written lines. And because the characters are also very boring, it just doesn't really work here. The film is pretty predictable too. You kind of can see where it's going in a lot of places. Not only that, there's two kind of major subplots in this film. I say major, but they probably don't get any more than like 5 minutes of screen time each. And they try and weave it in here into the film, and we don't care about it at all. We don't know. First, the main subplot that I'm talking about is sort of with his friend, who I literally don't know the name of. I don't even remember if they say her name realistically. She is completely like not fleshed out at all. We don't know her as a character. And so when we get a scene with her and not our main characters, it just doesn't make any sense that we would care about it at all. We don't even really get many scenes, if any, I don't think, alone with Grace. And for some reason we get a scene alone with this side character who's supposed to be much more compelling. And has been kind of like hinted at that she has this romance with somebody else, and it's just kind of like a completely unnecessary subplot and doesn't move the story or the characters ahead at all. And speaking of the characters, let's move on to some of the acting. I think the acting is okay in this. I don't think it's terrible because I have to say that the dialogue is not very good. It just feels like they're really trying their best here. There's sort of this style of acting that I've noticed in a lot of teenage movies where the dialogue is so unnatural and corny that young actors have to take lots of pauses and do sort of like very little with their inflection, but still kind of stay in the same vocal range, but do a lot of like speeding up, slowing down, pausing, stopping, starting again, and just to make the dialogue feel a little bit more natural, like it's supposed to be a train of thought and not pre-written like 6 times. And once you kind of like are aware of that style of acting, it so does not work. And I feel bad because I really feel like these actors are trying their best, they're working their hardest, but it just doesn't work with this dialogue. I think Lily Reinhart is probably the standout here. She doesn't have much, again, she doesn't have much to go off of. For most of the movie, she's kind of one note. She has one moment early on where she gets sort of an emotional outburst, and then towards the end of the film, she gets that a little bit more. But even still, it's not great. I think part of it is because we don't particularly care about just the scene at hand anyway, and so I do feel like she's trying her best here. When she's not doing sort of these big emotional moments and it's sort of that one note, this is kind of across the board, but I definitely noticed a lot for her earlier first. Everything's kind of said in like a low whisper. And it feels like I'm watching like an ASMR video that all the characters are doing that. Austin Abrams has mostly vocal fry for this movie where he's like kind of talking like this for a lot of it. And every line is said so slowly, which I'll talk about the pacing in just a second, but it like feels like all these actors are like dragging their feet through the mud. And because a lot of the acting is one note in that way, that doesn't feel like there's a lot of emotion. And I have to say that the two lead actors do not have very strong chemistry at all. And so not only is like the story uncompelling, but the acting doesn't work well together. And I don't know whether that's a fault of the acting or the directing, but it just doesn't feel like any of it works on an emotional level. This is kind of going back to Screenplay, but like talking about Henry as a character, I said that he doesn't do anything in this movie, which he doesn't, but not only that, he doesn't like ask any questions in this movie. It just feels like everybody around him is just randomly telling him things for some reason because the story needs it to. Like he doesn't feel like a character that cares about anybody. Like he just kind of sits there. It's like he has this aura that just tells people to spill the secrets in their life. And it just doesn't really work because you just it's so clearly a plot device that his character as a whole just feels like it doesn't even fit and it's really unnatural. Moving into more of the sort of like production side of things, the production design here is just pretty like lackluster. We just don't see a lot of it. Some of the production design, I think, is most apparent in people's bedrooms. We see Henry's the most, and it just doesn't kind of like invite any sort of criticism at all. It's just sort of like there's nothing that stands out about it. The thing that stands out the most, I think, is the costume choices, because it's supposed to, particularly for Grace's character. She wears a lot of these like big baggy clothes, and at first I really didn't like it, particularly because there's a moment sort of about 2/3 of the way through the movie where she strips those clothes, not like fully, but like she doesn't wear a lot of the big bulky clothes, and she's wearing just much lighter clothing, and so in a sense more revealing clothing. And when that happens, like a lot of the characters are like, whoa, oh my god, she's attractive now. It just like feels very sort of like She's All That type, where it's like, oh my god, she's pretty actually, come sit with us. And it just kind of like was almost insulting as an audience member. But I actually do kind of like the reasoning when they reveal it as a plot device. I don't like the plot, and I don't like where they went with it given the tone of the movie. I think it could have worked in a sense, but the costuming at least fits it pretty well, and I think it's an interesting reveal. As far as the cinematography goes, I would say it's similar to the production design, where it's pretty like lackluster, but the thing that really annoyed me the most is that every shot is either really blue or really orange. And I think I've said this before, but that's such a common color palette for like big blockbuster movies, like mid 2000s, like early 2000s, where it was a lot of blues and oranges, because orange is sort of the color that complements most skin tones in a way, or like that's kind of the color that skin tones give off. And because blue is the complementary color of that sort of bounces off each other really well. And it was in like every major blockbuster, but it really hasn't shown its way, at least like so apparently, in a lot of films, because it's been done so commonly. And if it happens in that early 2000s era, I kind of give it a pass, because like it might be one of the first to do it, or it was just like that was kind of the era of filmmaking. But here it's like not a blockbuster. It doesn't really work. It's trying to make the lighting more dynamic than it actually is. Usually there's no like complements to the color. Like sometimes it's that blue and orange, but there'll be scenes where it's kind of like all red and there's nothing that stands out or pops. It's just sort of like one plain color to make the visuals a little more interesting. There's also no real creativity with any of the shots. There are a couple like really interesting framing choices that they could have made. There's a location in the film that's sort of like an underground spot that has a lot of that has a pond and koi fish. And there's a scene where they're feeding the koi fish, and koi fish are very colorful, and they're in this very dark environment. And they kind of do this like almost overhead shot, but it's not quite. And if they had done a symmetrical overhead shot where the koi fish like popped out, it would have been a way more interesting way to frame that. Later on in the film, they go back there and Grace is wearing a much more dramatic costume choice. And it just could have been framed way more interestingly, as opposed to like caking it in this blue dark light. It just ends up being very boring. And there's also this really strange choice at some point where they FaceTime, and they never like establish they're actually FaceTiming. You just see them not together. It's like a back and forth shot of them, and it's super grainy and close up, and it doesn't work at all. It just looks like they filmed it on like a camcorder. It just is super strange. And that takes place during a montage, which brings me to the editing. They build a lot of emotional moments through montage, and it just feels very lazy. Because of the fact that these two actors don't really have any strong chemistry, instead of like having real character moments where they build them up romantically and we actually have some sort of like care for this relationship, instead they do it through montage, and so nothing actually feels established. We don't even know if they're dating at that point. We just know that they like each other, and they now have like revealed it to one another, and it just is kind of lazy filmmaking. There's also a montage towards the end that serves as a more dramatic reasoning, or kind of a dramatic way of doing the same thing. And it just feels like they didn't have the chops to pull it off, either in the acting or the directing or the screenplay. And so they were like, all right, let's just do it in the editing, so then the audience can at least get a sense of what we're trying to do here. So that doesn't work very well. And then when it's not doing that, it is so slow. It is trudging along. And the story is just not compelling enough for us to wait for any of these reveals. for us to sit with these completely underdeveloped characters, and so none of that works. As far as the sound goes, it has sort of this indie song soundtrack, which isn't bad. I think it's like song choices are interesting. But the score itself tries to mimic that, where it has sort of like this guitar solo, very indie score, and it really feels like all of the songs sound the same, and they're like, it just sounds like I could have looked up like guitar royalty-free indie on YouTube, and I could have found the same songs. So it's just nothing, it just doesn't stand out. It doesn't, it also doesn't like sit in the background, like you could hear it, but it doesn't draw attention to itself in an interesting way. It's not a very creative choice. And it just feels, again, kind of lazy. A lot of this film feels that way. And then kind of ending things with the directing. I just don't think that the theme and the story mesh at all. The theme is much more grandiose than the story is, and we're seeing it through the lens, of sort of the most uninteresting character, as opposed to actually delving into the psychology of sort of the character that we probably should be paying more attention to. And so in that sense, it kind of lacks a lot of, narrative direction that kind of goes along with the motifs and the themes that are trying to be established here. So I wish that this movie had more to, or not that I wish that it had more to say, because it has something to say, but it just doesn't say it very well, and none of the production choices or the story choices mesh well with the message of the film. So instead it just tries to tell you this message that is not actually conveyed in the story at hand. And it feels very lackluster and lazy and a little boring. So unfortunately, that's Chemical Hearts. As far as like a new movie to watch, I can't say that I recommend it. I'm going to give this one a soft 3 out of 10. It's pretty weak overall. If you're going to look for a romantic movie, I would definitely try and find something else. Something maybe like the next 2 movies that I'll be talking about, which I can recommend a little bit more highly. And so those 2 movies are my weekly watch, Almost Famous, and then my weekly recommendation, which is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And then finally, stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I talk about my top 5 movie couples of all time. But right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my review of Chemical Hearts. Now I'm going to go into my weekly watch, which was Almost Famous, and my weekly recommendation, which is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And at the very end of the episode, I'll be running down my top 5 movie couples of all time. But right now, we're talking about Almost Famous. This is a film from 2000, written and directed by Cameron Crowe. It stars Billy Crudup, Patrick Fugit, and Kate Hudson. It follows a 15-year-old young reporter named William Miller, who's given the chance to tour with an up-and-coming rock band, to write an article for Rolling Stone, and sort of how that transforms his life and the lives of those around him. So I had definitely been curious to watch this film for a while. It had been on tons and tons of lists of like great coming of age movies, interesting romantic stories, and so I've wanted to watch it for a long time. And I have to say that I wasn't disappointed. I don't think it like stood out to me more than I would have wanted it to. It's not like one of my favorite movies ever. I think it's pretty darn good though. There's a lot of great things going for it. It's one of those movies that I recognize myself that if I had watched it a couple years prior, I probably would have loved it, because it takes place, it's like this 15-year-old kid getting to do this crazy thing without his parents. It's just like this super cool, seemingly very cool depiction of what it is to be an adult, at least for like a lot of it. If you're watching it as that age, you probably see that being like, oh, being an adult is awesome. Whereas if you're watching it as an adult, you're like, oh, this is difficult. I see the nuances and like tragedy of a lot of these characters. And so I think if I had watched it then, I probably would have been very, very into it. But instead I just think it's like a good movie that I liked, that I enjoyed watching for sure. And so a lot of that comes down to the screenplay, of course, where I like to start for most of these things. I think the screenplay is pretty well written. There are a couple places where I think it could have been a little bit tighter. It's only 2 hours, so it's not all that long, but the story isn't as focused for as long as I would have wanted it to be, because obviously the tour is the most interesting part of the film. But it takes a good long time for us to get there. The film starts out with sort of this opening prologue in a sense, before he's actually 15. It's when he's like 11 with his older sister played by Zooey Deschanel, which has to be one of Zooey Deschanel's, earliest acting credits. She looks very young here. And although I like a lot of this scene and a lot of sort of like what this is trying to convey, it really is a lot of just character development, and it's not even really character development for William. It's mostly character development for his mother, played by Frances McDormand. And so and kind of just to establish what his home life is like and who he might be as a character later on, how these people influence him. And I just think that not all of it is necessary. I think the development could have been done a little bit quicker, just to get into the meat of this story a lot more. But that being said, that's kind of the only downside I have to the screenplay at hand. I think it's really well written as far as like dialogue. There are a lot of really clever moments, some really clever reveals too that we don't know necessarily early on. I think they're revealed at really nice times. The best part about this movie is that the individual scene work I think is excellent. So transitioning from one scene to another isn't always as interesting, but the scenes themselves I think work really well from a narrative standpoint. Any scene with the band I think is really great. I love it. I think the band is super interesting. There is a scene with sort of the main band member where he goes to a house party, and I think that scene works really well. I think it's very fun. The climactic scene at towards the end of the movie, that's sort of the emotional thesis of the film, is really great. I think that was probably my favorite scene, and I think it's good that my favorite scene is kind of saved to the end. And then that climax is really great, but also it kind of feeds into an epilogue, which is nice that it has sort of a prologue and an epilogue, but then the epilogue I think is awesome. I think both the climax and the epilogue are great. Really the last 30 minutes are probably the best part of this movie. They have a lot of the emotional core of it, and a lot of loose strings and sort of inside jokes tie together really nicely here. And so I think that it ends on a really great note. So even though I think the beginning and the middle are pretty strong, I think that the ending by far, is the best part of this film. And that's what you're going to want. You want to leave your audience with a good kind of note to end on. And so it definitely does that here. The acting all around is also very good. I don't think there's any sort of weak point in here. I have to say that this film is, at least to my knowledge, was sort of marketed as being much more of a love story and much more about Penny Lane as a character than I expected. She's really kind of takes a backseat to the story between William and, I'm forgetting the lead band member's name. Russell Hammond. So it kind of takes a backseat to Russell and William's relationship, which I think is a much more interesting relationship to begin with. We've talked about Manic Pixie Dream Girls on this show before. Penny Lane definitely fits that trope. She's kind of a common, ideal of what the Manic Pixie Dream Girl is and what it kind of was set out to be. It definitely is she's kind of like this empty, almost quirky character, that serves to enhance the men in their lives, in the story at hand. And so there are moments where Penny Lane has a much stronger emotion shine through, and you can kind of like guess a lot of the things that she's been going through and a lot of her internal struggles, but that's sort of the problem there. It's all sort of like has to be inferred. None of it is a part of the story, and none of it actually serves any reason for the story. So that definitely is a problem there, and I think that her character overall is a little bit uncompelling and boring. So even for a Manic Pixie Dream Girl that is supposed to be like this much more like fun-loving, interesting character, I just don't think she's all that interesting. But that's less about the acting. I think Kate Hudson does a perfectly good job at that, the character that she's been given. I just think it's a fairly underwritten character. But like I said, the band is great. I think all of them stand out extremely well. Russell Hammond, played by Billy Crudup, I think is very clearly the standout. He has sort of this cool persona that gets torn down through a lot of the film, and all of that works really well. I also think Jason Lee is awesome. I couldn't remember where he was from, and then I remember that he's from Alvin and the Chipmunks, and they play Alvin and the Chipmunks at the very beginning of this movie, so I thought that was kind of like ironic. But Jason Lee is super fun in this movie, but the big knockout performance here is Frances McDormand. I love this character, and I think Frances McDormand kills it in this role. She's both like commanding and sympathetic, and even though she's supposed to be this really strict character, we really feel for her, and we're kind of on her side for most of the film. She really creates this very likable character, even though it's sort of written as a very unlikable character. So she really brings a lot to this film. And there's also just like a ton of famous actors in this movie that were not famous at the time. They just keep coming. So like Zooey Deschanel's in the beginning. Jimmy Fallon comes in at the end, and he is dressed so goofy. I know it's like a 70s look, but I just think it's very funny. There's also the actor who plays Cam on Modern Family comes in at a certain point. Jay Baruchel plays like a recurring character as sort of like this groupie teenager, and he's very young, so that was definitely a fun little note to have. So there are a ton of famous actors who are in this movie, and I think that just sort of adds to the world of it, because it's all about being famous, so it sort of works in hindsight a lot better, because of the fact that these actors weren't famous, but then you get sort of like, you're kind of starstruck throughout a lot of this movie, which was definitely really fun. And then talking about the lead, played by Patrick Fugit or Fugit, I'm not sure, but he is definitely very good in this movie. I think there's like, the whole point of it is that he's this sort of reporter who is supposed to be sort of a silent observer, but doesn't really serve that. But I think from an audience perspective, he serves as a really nice kind of like vessel for the audience. He's pretty impartial throughout a lot of it, but given that we see a lot of the kind of weak, sad moments of these adult characters, we feel frustrated with our lead character, and I think that he kind of has this very empathetic look to him. It just kind of invites us in to experience things through his eyes, so I think he does a really great job at that. It definitely feels very fly on the wall, which also works for the cinematography. I think the cinematography is supposed to be much more kind of observer based. There aren't a lot of like compelling decisions to have a close-up here or have an extreme wide shot here. I'm sure, obviously, I'm not trying to undermine the decisions that were made. I'm sure they were very apparent and very important, but from like a audience perspective, it definitely feels very fly on the wall. There are a lot of interesting moments for close-ups, but they don't really serve in the same way that a lot of movies do, where it's supposed to be understanding what the character is thinking. They feel much more aesthetic based, that we're supposed to be seeing this character through the eyes of our lead. Which I do think works really well here. I actually kind of like that as a creative decision. And then sort of the only other obvious cinematography point is that there's these sort of like supposedly epic sweeping transitional shots kind of from city to city that take place a lot of times during like a sunset where the bus is silhouetted. And although I don't usually like moments like this where you can see that they just want to have a scene transition and don't necessarily know how to pull that off or how to do anything interesting with it, I actually think it works here to create this sense of our lead character feeling like this is sort of an odyssey for him, which I do really like. And the bus too serves in a really great production design moment, because I think the bus kind of has its own character to it, and when we move from the bus to the plane, sort of in that third act, we feel that we've kind of lived on this bus the whole time, and our main characters are on this bus, and we really like, it just kind of creates this sort of sense of, familiarity and this sort of family dynamic. So then when we kind of like abandon it, it feels like a loss. And I actually really like that from both a narrative decision and from a production design decision. The other kind of main production design thing is that it takes place during the 70s, and so there's a lot of like pretty obvious costuming choices, which I think are very fun to look at. They are seemingly very fitting. I was not alive in the 70s, so I have to kind of infer from other pieces of media, but they seem like they work. The character that pops out the most as far as costuming goes is definitely Penny Lane, and that's intentional, and I do think that that works. It has sort of this fun, upbeat vibe to her, and she kind of stands out in any scene because most characters are wearing a lot of like browns and tans, and she's always kind of wearing this like red color that kind of stands out in a really nice way. As far as the other moments, the editing There are moments that I think could have been tighter, but that kind of goes along with the screenplay. And sometimes with the editing, scenes maybe could have ended a bit earlier, but that's not all that common. I think some of those transitions are a little bit unimportant, but I do kind of like what they serve, like I said earlier. So overall, I think the editing is pretty inoffensive. It doesn't draw attention to itself, and so in that sense, it works as it's supposed to. We feel like this is a very natural evolution of things, and so I think the editing is very well done, even if there are no overt or creative decisions being made from an editing standpoint. And then for the directing, this story is based off of Cameron Crowe's life, so he very clearly has a story to tell. He has a really good sense of the emotions that go along with it, so although there are some screenplay moments that I don't think work as well, I think he really gets what it's like to be like a young kid, kind of unlike Chemical Hearts, where it's supposed to be trying to portray that. Here, we actually get a sense of that where it's not overtly told to us, but we actually feel that because of how we feel with our main character. And when he has these emotional outbursts, it feels warranted, makes a lot of sense, and is ultimately very cathartic to watch. And so I think Cameron Crowe really had a story to tell. Although there's nothing like super intense about what to say, it feels very much like young kid going through coming of age, maybe sort of like an honesty thing. There are some larger morality issues that pop up. But regardless, Cameron Crowe definitely has a very clear story to tell, and everything serves that main story. So I think in that sense, it works very, very well. And so I enjoyed this movie. I think it's a fun watch. I think it's definitely a much more fun watch if you're a little bit younger, but you can still empathize with these characters and really latch on to some of the more adult characters throughout the film. And so I'm going to give this one a soft to solid 7. It's definitely enjoyable, fun watch. Watch it with some friends. Can definitely recommend it. Don't know if I would highly recommend it, but if it's something that you're interested in, something that you think you would like, I can recommend it for that. So next up, I'm going to be talking about my big weekly recommendation, which is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, one of my favorite films of all time. And then stay tuned until the very end where I talk about my top 5 movie couples ever. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my reviews of Chemical Hearts and Almost Famous. I will now be talking about my weekly recommendation, which is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And for the last segment, I'll be talking about my top 5 movie couples of all time. But right now, we're getting into Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. It is such a good film, and I watched it again this week, so I actually watched a little bit more movies than I was used to, but I wanted to check it out again, and it's on Netflix, and it really holds up so well. So, this film is written by Charlie Kaufman and directed by Michael Gondry. It stars Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet, and it basically follows Joel, played by Jim Carrey, as he discovers that his ex-girlfriend has erased him from her memory, based on like a new scientific procedure, and so he decides to do the same thing, but during the procedure he realizes that there are a lot of memories that he wants to keep and doesn't necessarily think that it's as good an idea as he thought. So it's a very high concept film, which it's a really genius idea. And I think I had kind of mentioned this in the Manic Pixie Dream Girl episode, but there are a lot of films that I think have very similar ideas and motifs that I've always really liked. One of which is sort of the dissection of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, which definitely exists here. And they've always been kind of some of my favorite movies, and this one is no exception. I think this one is so mature. In fact, this one kind of is growing with me a lot more. I watched it relatively young, and I think there are nuances that I didn't quite understand at the time as far as like more mature relationships and being an adult. And so I think all of those things are just, there's so much care taken into this movie, and just everything is done so meticulously, and I really just adore this movie. And so I mentioned Charlie Kaufman because he's actually sort of the bigger name as far as the production side goes. I don't usually mention the writer, but he's written a lot of different things that are very high concept and have very apparent themes, but are much more complex at hand. And so I have always liked a lot of his movies. So if you don't already know, he directed like Being John Malkovich and like Adaptation. He's got a new movie coming out in a couple weeks, which I'm excited to watch. I'll be reviewing that when it comes out. But I just think that he is one of my favorite writers in Hollywood right now. I think he has some really creative stories that dive into some really deep topics in much more creative and interesting ways than other movies do. And so this is no exception. This one is a very high concept film, but it is at no expense to the actual emotion of it. So the story takes place mostly inside Joel's mind. So there's a lot of creative choices that you can do here. Not only from a screenplay standpoint, but just from every filmmaking standpoint. And so because it all takes place in his head, there are a lot of emotional moments, or a lot of just scenes that are caked in emotion, and the emotion stands out a lot more than even the scene does. And so this high concept idea is not even more interesting than the actual characters or emotional beats in the film. In fact, sometimes they're even less interesting. You don't even need them to be there. And I think that's kind of the joy of Charlie Kaufman, is that he has these really original ideas, but his characters are also so fleshed out that you don't even need those original ideas for it to be an interesting story. Eternal Sunshine would have been just as good a movie, well, maybe not just good a movie, but a very, very good movie if it didn't have this high concept, because the characters are so well written. The narrative flows so well, but it has this high concept which just elevates it to kind of the extreme. And even though it takes place mostly inside Joel's head, a lot of the moments are still very natural and very resonant. All of the character decisions make a lot of sense. There are some fantastic subplots, unlike Chemical Hearts. There are some really great subplots that I completely forgot about. There's a fantastic subplot with Tom Wilkinson and Kirsten Dunst. And Mark Ruffalo, kind of, that I like, because the film is just so good and so expansive, I completely just forgot about it. And it's one of the most important parts of the movie. And it not only is it really important just from a character standpoint, not only is it interesting to watch, but it also propels the main narrative forward, which is sort of the purpose of subplots anyway. A lot of the main character moments wouldn't have existed without this subplot, which is really quite miraculous that you can do that in a script that fits so well. All of the story beats fit really well. And I think that's what's so nice, is that there's these really high concept ideas, but everything still feels very natural. It's also somewhat told out of order or backwards order, you can kind of argue. And it's also very back and forth between different subplots. So it's, in some films, and in more amateur films, it'd be hard to keep track of, but both Michael Gondry and Charlie Kaufman do a really great job making sure the audience is aware of what's going on from a narrative standpoint, even if some of the emotions or some of the like individual scene moments are a bit more confusing, and you might not even understand them until the end of the film or after the film. And I think that just adds to how enjoyable of a watch it is, because you're confused in places that make sense, but it's not too confusing that you can't even follow the story. It's just really, really tightly written. The acting, too, is just absolutely off the charts. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish really good acting in films. I want to say films like this, but there kind of are no films like this. But films that are much more focused on the romantic side of things, or just natural characters in natural scenes. So this is much more high concept than that in a lot of places. But there are a lot of just very common moments between characters, and so sometimes it's hard to distinguish good acting there, but all of the acting in this film is different. All of the characters have their own personality traits that are not thrown in your face. They're just different than each other. There's some really great range. I think Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet knock it out of the park in this. They have ups and downs that fit a relationship. You feel for them. You feel angry at them at different points. We don't know who to root for in certain scenes, which I think works extremely well. I honestly think that Jim Carrey is a more interesting dramatic actor. I think he's a fantastic comedian. He has a very specific style of comedy, that he almost pioneered in a sense. But I think that a lot of his dramatic choices are insane. Like, he picks these great movies. Like, it's kind of just this and The Truman Show. I guess you could, like, what is it, The Cable Guy? That's one, right? Kind of more dramatic, but still a little bit silly. He just makes some really great dramatic choices, and it kind of shows off his chops as an actor regardless, because he really kills it in this performance. And then Kate Winslet does the same thing, because she just is so up and down in this film. This is kind of the problem with a lot of Manic Pixie Dream Girls, is that we don't get this sense of range. They're just sort of quirky for quirky's sake. But this is before the term was even coined, and it was still dissecting it. There's a specific scene that gets cited a lot, where she talks about the fact that she is not there. People see her as kind of an idea that she can fix them, or that they can fix. And it sort of is pretty apparently saying what a lot of people believe in relationships, and in what a sense, what Joel believed in this relationship. And so she plays that character so well that she has all these sort of like side quirks, but really has this internal struggle with it, and doesn't really know what to do with it in a lot of senses. And she's just a very confused character, not knowing where to go. And sometimes that relationship will help, and sometimes it'll hurt her. And she just has a completely back and forth character that works so well, even when it's not really from her perspective, which is both a credit to her acting and the screenwriting. And the biggest joy in this film is that all of the side characters are just as good. So we get more time with Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet, and so that's why I think their characters stand out. Obviously, they're the leads. But there's a lot of big name actors in this film. So Tom Wilkinson's in it, Mark Ruffalo, Kirsten Dunst, Elijah Wood, David Cross is in a couple scenes, and all of those characters feel like they have a character. Like, they're not just there to exist in this world to fill space. They have their own motives, their own ideas, and we actually get moments where we get to see those motivations and see what they're doing, and a lot of times why they're doing it, both in the performance and in the writing. I know I keep raving about the writing, but I kind of can't get enough of the screenplay. But we get a lot of those moments that sometimes may not even feel necessary, but they just expand upon the world, and a lot of times move either the plot forward or move our main character's story and ideas forward, which is really, like, it's just really great. A lot of times in these weekly recommendations, if it's one of my favorite movies, I'll just like rave about it. I have so much to say. And that's definitely the case here. And one of the things is the production design. The production design is insane because of the fact that there's so many complex things going on here, and there's so many different story beats. Like, there are things early on in the film that we'll see that don't come back until the very end because of the fact that we're kind of going backwards in a relationship. The decision to do different things with the prop choices that we have when the mind is getting erased is just really clever and kind of just creates this very holistic world. Everything also feels very messy, which is also, it just feels very real. It's somewhat symbolic of the relationship because the relationship is messy and that's supposed to be portrayed here, but it also just makes it feel a lot more realistic in a film that doesn't feel realistic all the time. The most interesting choice here, though, is very clearly Clementine's hair. And it's something that gets talked about a good amount too, but it's such an excellent decision because a lot of times hair in film, and colored hair in particular, doesn't really do anything to move the plot forward, and sometimes it'll move a character's plot forward, which is just as interesting an idea. But take, for example, Ramona Flowers. She changes her hair a bunch, but there's not really any reason for her to do it from a narrative or character standpoint. She just does it because she likes it, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but her character's a little bit less fleshed out than it should be, and so the hair just feels like a cool idea tacked on to something that's not as fulfilled. And don't get me wrong, I love Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, don't get mad at me. But that's just sort of an example. And here, Clementine's hair not only shows her the impulsivity of her character, but it also lets the audience know where we are from a story standpoint. So she changes her hair color 3 times, and it almost splits up the acts. It splits it up into 1, 2, and 3. So we know where we are, and it's kind of moving backwards, and so we can actually understand where each character is at and where the story is at based on the color of her hair, which is something that you really only get kind of on like a second or third watch. You can probably distinguish it on a first watch, but you might not distinguish why it's so important. But I just think that that's such a clever decision, and not only is it something that is aesthetically interesting, so from like a design standpoint, it's a very interesting thing to like visually, but it also works from a story and character standpoint, so it works in all three of these realms, which is really just crazy. The cinematography for a lot of moments does the same thing that the production design does, where it feels very messy and gritty and all over the place. And there are some really creative moments that take place in Joel's head that are very confusing, and the cinematography does a similar thing, where you're not necessarily sure what you should be looking at, why the camera's moving where it is, and so it creates this dynamic that feels very confusing, feels very heady, which is an important thing to be showing in this film. There are also just some very creative and beautiful shots that go hand in hand with how great the VFX are for a film from 2004. There's some shots with cars falling, and shots with like a house crumbling that don't even look unnatural. They look like they totally fit in this world. One of my favorite things though is that the camera has a really great sense of when to be an observer and when to be a participant. So a lot of times in those subplot moments, we're seeing things from somebody else's perspective, through a window, through obviously like the computer, through a character's mind, and that takes place in Joel's head too, that we're seeing things from his perspective. And so the camera kind of knows when to jump into a scene, and so we feel like we're in it with them, so we're seeing things in like a one shot, a close up, but then there are also moments that we feel like we shouldn't be seeing a lot of these things. So there's a particular moment sort of 2/3 the way through the movie with Kirsten Dunst's character where we're seeing things from a very different perspective. And so the camera really knows when we should feel like an observer and when we should feel like somebody who is in the thralls of the emotions. And another one of the great decisions here is when to use two shots and when to use one shots. And so when we're kind of focused on one character and one character's feeling, which happens a lot when we're with Joel, or when to focus on two characters at the same time, which is when we're with Joel and Clementine. And that tends to happen mostly when they're together in the beginning of the relationship and together towards the end of the movie, as opposed to when they're not kind of in sync with each other in the middle of their relationship, towards the end of their relationship, where we get a lot of solo shots between them. We don't get a lot of two shots with them. And then that kind of bears its fruit in that final shot with Joel and Clementine. So it's not a spoiler because I won't tell you what that shot is, but we actually get a final feeling of what Joel's arc is, and what he's really learned in this movie, and that kind of shows itself through that final shot and why we're seeing things from that angle, which I think is really beautiful. One of my favorite choices is a choice that I really didn't understand until this most recent viewing, is for the editing. There's a moment where Joel is kind of sitting on the bed, or sitting in his car, and he's just kind of waiting there. And then it cuts to a moment much earlier in the chronological timeline of him crying in his car. And it's a pretty jarring cut for a single location. I kind of felt like, oh, maybe that could have been a match cut, or that could have been something that was a little bit more dynamic. And that tends to happen a couple times. But what I really like is that all of the really interesting transitions, because there are a ton of interesting creative transitions, happen in Joel's head when things are supposed to feel a lot more seamless. And then when we're existing in the real world, the transitions are much more similar to like linear film editing, where it's just we're going back and forth. We're not going to really do anything interesting that blends these scenes seamlessly. So all of that happens in his head when things are getting erased or things are different than he might remember it. And then the much more like simple technique style of editing happens in the real world, which is something that I really didn't get until this most recent viewing, which I thought was a extremely like subtle, clever choice for something that they really could have done some creative choices or some creative editing decisions when he exists in the real world. But to draw that line, I think was really important to do from kind of a subconscious standpoint. There's a voiceover in this film, which I don't always like, but because it takes place from Joel's perspective in Joel's head, there are some moments that I actually really like that voiceover. It kind of like accents things really nicely. It mostly is sort of in the beginning and the end of the film when we're not as familiar with his internal psyche or his brain, what he's actually like going through, what he's remembering. And so I like having that kind of window into him at all times, whether it's visually during the procedure or whether it's through a voiceover. The music is both the score and the soundtrack have some really creative choices, but are also very subtle. They don't kind of throw anything in your face as to what the themes of the film are. They work, they're memorable, they're kind of subtle, and they're very like sweet choices that accent scenes really nicely, complement things really nicely. But I think the sound design is really excellent here because of the fact that things are like, the thing that stands out to me the most is when people get erased in memory. There's a little pop sound. There are just some things that feel very subtle, or you just might not even register as being important, but they really add to the depth of the world, even when we're kind of in Joel's head and we're seeing things that don't really exist. You got to have some creative sound choices to make them feel a lot more realistic. And I think the sound design here, there's a lot of like attention that was taken that I think really enhances that story. So then finally, the directing. There's a really great understanding between the writer and the director. Charlie Kaufman always has this very unique vision, and I think that Michael Gondry really understood that and got to kind of complement it in his own directing style. And there's a really great kind of back and forth dialogue between the writer and the director that you can even see when you're watching the film, that I think all of it works in tandem really well. And I also just think that from a directing standpoint, Michael Gondry, through all of his choices, has created this really fleshed out, holistic world, this universe that we get to get implanted in for 2 hours. And it really feels like there was a storyline, there was a world before we got there, and there's going to be one long after we leave, which is something that's really hard to convey a lot of times. But it really feels like we're in this alternate universe for a little bit of time, and he's created something, and we're just kind of passerbys, we're visitors, passersby, whatever. We're just visitors, and there has very clearly been something before this, and now we get to experience it for a little bit, and then we get to fantasize about what it'll be, because it definitely will be something once we leave. And so he's created this completely unique world that we get to just be in for a little bit of time, which I think is really beautiful. And works on every level, every production level. So I love this film. It is resonant. It is unique. It's creative. It has every aspect of a film that you could really want. So much emotion. So I'm going to give this one a solid 10 out of 10. One of my favorite movies. Can highly recommend it. It's streaming on Netflix right now. So if you haven't watched it and you got some time on your hands, it's a great watch alone. It's a great watch with friends, with family. I think anybody can really enjoy it. If you're kind of like over the right age to watch it, if it's appropriate for you. So highly recommend this film. And those are the 3 films for the day. But right now we're going to talk about my top 5 movie romances, movie couples of all time. But right now we're going to take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my reviews of Chemical Hearts, Almost Famous, and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And because all 3 of those films are fairly romantic films, we're going to talk about my top 5 movie couples of all time. So this segment might be a little bit shorter than some other sort of like final segments in other episodes because this is a very subjective list. There isn't really a lot of reasoning behind a lot of these things. I can give you as much reasoning as I can, but these are just are couples that I think work really well. And a lot of them, it was a really hard list to come up with. There are a lot of films that I like that are romance films, but I just think that like one of the characters stands out a lot more, or one of the characters isn't in it as much, or the concept is more creative than the couple. And so some of these films are not romantic films, but I just think that the chemistry works really well. The couple is just very romantic, and have a very nuanced relationship. And so it's sort of inevitable that every choice on this list is going to have great chemistry, so I'll try to not use that as much, but it might come up in every couple. But let's see if you agree with me. So number 5, it's a little bit of an unconventional choice, but this one is Mr. Incredible and Elastigirl. I think they have a very interesting relationship in this film. I like how, there's 2 films now, Incredibles 2, and I think they actually serve, great storyline in both films. So I really like the family aspect of it all. I like the challenge between like the work balance and the life balance. This film obviously like is way more complex than it should be for a 2004 kids movie, but it's really got a lot to say about a family dynamic and ultimately about a relationship dynamic. And I also think that it's really fun to have such an interesting, nuanced relationship from voice actors. And I think that the performance that's given by both of these actors create a dynamic and leveled relationship, and so that's why it's number 5. Number 4 on this list is another film that is not a romance film, but the romantic couple takes center stage, and that's Rocky. So Rocky and Adrian from the first Rocky film and the subsequent Rocky films. But I actually have only seen the first Rocky, so I can't really talk about those. What's really great about this film is that it should be a film about boxing, a character study, but instead it's much more about the relationship. I really like how Adrian and Rocky complement each other really nicely to move each other's plot forward. Adrian is a very sympathetic character that really helps Rocky through a very challenging time. And so although we're much more focused on Rocky, I think that she has a lot of emotion, a lot of great character development in this film. And ultimately, the film is much more about the two of them than it is about anything else. And so I think that the fact that this relationship takes the main part of the film, and the film is much more focused on delving into their relationship dynamics, works kind of on multiple different levels from a character standpoint and from a relationship standpoint. And so that's why it's number 4 on the list. Number 3 is a very romantic couple, that might not even show sort of the like up and downs of a relationship, but I think it kind of has to be on this list. And that is Wesley and Princess Buttercup from The Princess Bride. It's really great to have sort of a like fantastical romance in this. It's got, I mean, obviously this film has like action, adventure, romance, like that's the point of the film. It's supposed to be this big overarching fairy tale. And Wesley and Buttercup are no exception. They have a little bit of these up and downs, but I think that both characters have agency in this film. They both have things to say in the relationship, things about the relationship. And they both have to kind of prove themselves to each other, which is a really great dynamic that they have. And they end up having just a really cute, but also just a really resonant relationship because of a lot of the trials and tribulations that they go through, both outside of the relationship and then therefore, together, that kind of bond them in a really nice way. And so that's why it is number 3. Number 2. You might recognize this one. It's Joel and Clementine from Eternal Sunshine. I try to stray away from putting the movie that I just talked about on a list. But I just think that this relationship is so nuanced. There's so much that goes on here. Having like getting to show a relationship through the ups and downs and through a breakup, and why these characters both complement each other and why they don't, like why they work well together, and then also showing why they don't work well together, and ultimately kind of their demise for a lot of it, but then maybe something past that, I think is really nice. Showing the characters both apart and together, I think works really well too. We get a sense of who they are and the puzzle pieces that they should fit together but don't necessarily do all the time. And how sometimes just like personal relationships with other people or different relationships with like the world around you can influence a relationship, and how that can kind of change things for better or for worse, and how not only that, but how a relationship can change you as a person even when you don't remember that relationship, I think is a really interesting thing to show. And so there's just so many layers to the Joel and Clementine relationship. The performances are obviously out of this world, and so that's why it's number 2 on the list. All right, we're coming into an hour into the podcast, and so I'll give you my number 1 couple of all time. It's another film series that I have reviewed on the podcast extensively, and that is Jesse and Celine from the Before trilogy. I really don't have too much to say about this couple because a lot of it just comes down to the chemistry and how real they are. How like it's it's one of the only romantic films that is very clearly from two perspectives. It's not from one or the other. It's just supposed to be a more realistic, more whole portrayal of a couple. And kind of just a connection between two people. This is legitimately the only movie couple that I've ever watched that I am genuinely disappointed that they're not in an actual relationship. I was almost like upset that they're not because they just work so well together. We get to see moments where they fight with each other but get back together. And we get to see moments where they're just really romantic with each other. I also just really like that by the end of the trilogy, we get to see how they're just so comfortable with each other and they've grown with each other and changed. And there are some just small moments that feel really grand and romantic because they just know each other so well. And so I just think that it's a little bit unfair because we get to spend more time with them. But really no more time than maybe like the Incredible series or the Rocky series. So I think that there's just so many different points to why this couple is so good. It comes down to like the performances and the chemistry and how the characters are characterized as a whole, with the time we get to spend with them. And so there's just so many elements. It's so romantic, dude. If you're looking for a good romantic movie, if I have not recommended the Before trilogy enough, that's what I gotta do. So Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, not as big a fan of Before Midnight, but definitely those first two. Just has such a good romance, a good relationship, a great couple. And so that is my number one choice. And that's the episode. It's not as romantic of an episode as I thought. I thought Almost Famous was going to be more focused on romance because I kind of create these topics before I actually start. But even still, we got through that. It was a fun episode. I really, really love Eternal Sunshine. I really liked Almost Famous, and I really didn't like Chemical Heart. So it was a good sort of like steady incline for this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. And let me know some of your favorite movie couples. You can tweet us at GSMC_movies. We're all checking that account. We love to hear your thoughts. And I definitely have missed some, or maybe some people disagree with me. So I want to hear your thoughts on some of your favorite movie couples. But that's the episode. As always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you could please remember to subscribe to the show and give us a nice review because that really helps us. If you could also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you and have a good one.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.